Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. So this video was thrown at me. Shout out to the ability to do video titled The Story Behind the Abbey Road Medley. Yes, this video spans a little over an hour. I'm not too sure what this video is going to unravel, but I'm super curious to find out. So without wasting much time, without further ado, let's check it out, guys.
We can't really break down the Abbey Road Medley track by track like we would with a typical set of songs. It was designed to be experienced as one continuous piece, an extended musical journey rather than a collection of separate songs. Because of that, it makes more sense to treat it as a single, unified work. It all starts with "You Never Give Me Your Money." The song's structure is pretty unique. It jumps between different sections without repeating verses or choruses, kind of like John's "Happiness is a Warm Gun." Another inspiration was Keith West's 1968 track, "Excerpt from a Teenage Opera." Eventually, with support from George Martin and the rest of the band, Paul started putting this idea into action. "I think it was my idea to put all the spare bits together, but I'm a bit wary of claiming these things," Paul said in Anthology. "I'm happy for it to be everybody's idea." Anyway, in the end we hit upon the idea of medleying them, and giving the second side a sort of operatic structure, which was great because it used 10 or 12 unfinished songs in a good way. At first, John seemed interested in the idea. In a May 1969 NME interview, not long after the Get Back single came out in April, John discussed the upcoming album, which was still being called Get Back at the time. "The next great Beatle event will be the next LP in about 8 weeks," he said. "A lot of the tracks will be like Get Back, and a lot of that we did in one take. We've done about 12 tracks. Some of them are still to be remixed. Also, Paul and I are now working on a kind of song montage that we might do as one piece on one side. We've got 2 weeks to finish the whole thing, so we're really working at it." That suggests that they were thinking about putting the song montage on the Get Back album, which they hoped to finish by June 1969. Producer Glyn Johns did assemble a version of the Get Back album on May 28th for a planned summer release, but the montage wasn't included, and that album never came out anyway. By then, Paul had already written "You Never Give Me Your Money," and John had "Mean Mr. Mustard" and "Polythene Pam" from the year before, but it was clear that the montage wouldn't be done in time. So in June, they decided to make a whole new album instead, which turned into Abbey Road later. This gave them more time to work on the medley while putting Let It Be on hold. In any case, Paul had originally written "You Never Give Me Your Money" as the opening to the medley. He had 3 song fragments that he hadn't finished on their own, so he strung them together. Talking about the medley as a whole, Paul said, "We did it this way because John and I had a number of songs, which were great as they were, but we'd finished them. It often happens that you write the first verse of a song, and then you've said it all and can't be bothered to write a second verse, repeating or giving a variation. So I said to John, 'Have you got any bits and pieces that we can make into one long track?' And he had, and we made a piece that makes sense all the way through." The first section, the soft piano part with the title lyrics, was about the Beatles' money problems, especially their dealings with Alan Klein. "This was me directly lambasting Alan Klein's attitude to us," Paul said. "No money, just funny paper, all promises, and it never works out. It's basically a song about no faith in the person that found its way into the medley on Abbey Road." John saw the humor in it. Paul didn't really interact with Klein while writing the song, but he definitely heard from the others about what Klein claimed he could do. He was a New York spiv who had come over to London, Paul said. I smelled a rat, but the other chaps didn't, so we had to fight over it, and I got voted down. Paul tried to avoid any direct confrontation with Klein by staying busy with studio work. But on May 9th, during a mixing session for the scrapped Get Back album, Klein showed up with an ultimatum.
I'd put forward Lee Eastman, Linda's dad, as a possible sort of lawyer and possibly someone to do. But they said, no, he'd be just too biased against you, for you and against us, which I could see.
Oh, yeah, well, we had great arguments with Paul. Well, the three of us felt, the three of us have gone this way, why don't you?
So there it was, and that then was a 3-to-1 situation. And in the Beatles, if any one doesn't agree with the plan, it was always vetoed. Very democratic that way. Okay. So the 3-to-1 thing was very awkward. And things would happen like, I remember being at Olympic Studio one evening, and we were supposed to be doing something on Abbey Road, I think. The three guys showed up, we all showed up at the studio ready to record, and Alan Klein showed up as part of the party with his sort of henchman. And they said, you've got to sign a contract for Klein. He's got to take it to his board. I said, it's Friday night. No, he doesn't work on a Saturday. Anyway, Alan Klein's a law unto himself. He hasn't got a board he has to report to, I said, don't worry. So we could easily do this on Monday. Let's do our session now. You're not going to push me into this. They said, oh, you're stalling. They said, he wants 15%, he wants 20%. I said, tell him he can have 15%. They said, you're stalling. And I said, no, I'm working for us. We're a big act. I remember the exact words, we're a big act. The Beatles, he'll take 15%. But for some strange reason, I think they were so intoxicated with him that they said, no, he's got to have 20% and he's got to report to his board tomorrow. You've got to sign now or never, kind of thing. I said, right, that's it. Well, I'm not signing now. There was a big argument, and they all went, leaving me at the studio. The thing with Apple was that we were great creators and we could do all of that, but nobody had half an idea about a budget. So, what we were spending, I think, was more than what we were earning.
There was nobody managing Apple. It was going, wasting away all this money. Nobody had any ability to be a business manager.
And so it was a question of who was going to do it, because I was doing it, but I was doing it on the basis that I'll do it until you find somebody who you want to do it, because I didn't want to do it. So that's why, somebody like Alan Klein had the opportunity to come in and say he could do it, but so did a lot of other people. What changed at Apple after he arrived? Everything. It was a completely different situation, Number one, right, first and foremost, Paul wasn't there.
Klein had been managing the Rolling Stones, and I believe Donovan. And John had met him, and he just came in one day and said, well, I'm going to get Klein to manage me, and that's what's happening.
And Alan was a human being, the same as Brian was a human being. It was the same thing with Brian in the early days. It was assessment, and I make a lot of mistakes character-wise, But now and then I make a good one,
Many months later.
A week ago today, 3 of the original 4 Beatles, John, George, Paul and Ringo, finally parted company with their fast-talking American manager, Alan Klein. Okay. A highly significant announcement for pop fans, because one of the reasons given for the original breakup of the Beatles was that after Brian Epstein's death, John, George and Ringo wanted Klein to manage the Beatles' complex business affairs and disagreed with Paul, who was against Klein and who wanted Lee Eastman, his wife's father, as manager. Okay.
John, can you tell me what happened with Alan Klein? Why did you and the other two try to decide finally to get rid of him?
Well, there are many reasons to finally give him the push, although I don't want to go into the details of it. Let's say that possibly Paul's suspicions were right, and the time was right. At the time, I do whatever I feel is right. And although I haven't been particularly happy personally for quite a long time with the situation, I didn't want to make any quick moves. And I wanted to see if maybe, something could work out.
The alternative to Klein, really, was possibly Lee Eastman, but I'm not at all sure that, Paul wanted Lee Eastman to be a manager in the sense that, you know, Brian Epstein had been a manager, or Alan Klein to be a manager in the sense of Brian Epstein being a manager.
Okay.
Since the first section of You Never Give Me Your Money had already been written and partly recorded 3 days earlier, it wasn't inspired by this event specifically, but Paul had clearly shown his concerns about Klein long before that. The second unfinished section, which Paul called Out of College in his personal notebook, seems to reflect the Beatles' early days, leaving behind school and ordinary jobs to take a chance on their dreams. They didn't have much money, but they were chasing that magic feeling of doing what they loved. On the original lyric sheet for this part, Paul ended with the phrase, "know where to go," and crossed out the K, obviously suggesting a double meaning. Others might have thought the Beatles had nowhere to go, but they knew exactly where they were headed. After a dramatic instrumental break, we heard the third section, One Sweet Dream, which Barry Miles describes as being about Paul and Linda's habit of going on aimless countryside drives. Paul said, "We used to like to escape London, and we'd just drive, going nowhere. We would try to get lost." Linda recalled, "As a kid, I loved getting lost. Then, when I moved to England to be with Paul, we would put Martha in the back of the car and drive out of London. I'd say, 'Let's get lost,' and we'd keep driving without looking for any signs. That's where lines like, 'Soon we'll be away from here, step on the gas and wipe that tear away,' came from."
Okay.
Paul also wrote Two of Us about these same drives. Around December of '68, John started writing a new song for Yoko called Don't Let Me Down. He mixed this with another idea where he swapped the words, "Here comes the sun, whoa, the sun," with "Don't Let Me Down." This version first showed up on January 2nd, 1969, during rehearsals at Twickenham Film Studios, the first day of the Get Back sessions. At this point, John was playing the chords in a unique way, using what some people call pull chords. You can hear a bit of this on the Fly on the Wall bonus disc from Let It Be, Naked. As they kept working on Don't Let Me Down later in January, the pull chords were dropped, but John kept playing around with them and began turning them into a new song. This version still included the Here Comes the Sun line and slowly evolved into what became Sun King. And even if it was only subconscious, this might have sparked the idea for George's Here Comes the Sun, which he wrote a few months later. John's early version of Sun King didn't have a name yet, and seemed to sit in the back of his mind for a while. It was just half a song I had, which I never finished, which was one way of getting rid of it without ever finishing it. Then in the medley, we just wanted a change of atmosphere, and Here Comes the Sun King. Why not? And here he comes, and everybody's happy, and quando per mucho, etc., etc. In 1980, John added, "That's a piece of garbage I had around." Even though George had already started recording his own Here Comes the Sun, John still decided to keep the original idea and lyrics from back in January. According to Steve Turner, John said Sun King came to him in a dream, suggesting it felt like an inspired piece of work. That may be true, but John was also known to be a big reader. Barry Miles suggests that John might have gotten the idea from the 1966 book The Sun King by Nancy Mitford, about France's Louis XIV, or maybe even from a review of it. A Hard Day's Right even imagines that John had a dream wherein the king entered his palace to find all his guests were laughing and happy after reading the book. Fast forward to July 24th. John brought the song into EMI Studios and finished writing and recording it, now calling it Here Comes the Sun King. He explained, "We just started joking, it's cod. Singing Cuando para mucho, so we just made it up. Paul knew a few Spanish words from school, so we just strung any Spanish words that sounded vaguely like something. And of course we got chica ferdi in. That's a Liverpool expression. Just like, sort of, it doesn't mean anything. Just like childish taunting, na 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 na.
Oh, okay.
The one we missed, we should have had, was Paranoia. We forgot all about it. We used to call ourselves Los Paranoias. Cake and eat it is another nice line too, because they have that in Spanish. Que or something can eat it. On July 24th, John brought in a more developed version of Here Comes the Sun King for the medley. That same day, he also introduced another incomplete song, Mean Mr. Mustard, with the intention of recording both together as part of the medley.
Okay.
Jeff Emerick relates how these two songs were both recorded together in a single pass. There's a slight gap between the two songs, so they could have easily been recorded separately. But knowing in advance that they would be sequenced in that order, John made the decision to play through them in one go, which made it a little more of a challenge to the band's musicianship, but they pulled it off. Emerick also recalled John being in good spirits, despite having recently been in a car accident with Yoko in Scotland. Yoko, who had a bed brought into the studio during earlier sessions to help her recover, no longer needed it, though the bed remained in the corner. John was actually in a pretty good mood throughout the entire session. I could see that he was a bit looser, a little more recovered from his injuries, and a lot less worried about Yoko, who was no longer lying in the bed, though it remained unmade in a corner of the studio, a mute reminder of the weirdness we'd had to deal with over the past few weeks.
Okay.
George explained in '87. At that time, Albatross by Fleetwood Mac was out, with all the reverb on guitar. So we said, let's be Fleetwood Mac doing Albatross just to get going. It never really sounded like Fleetwood Mac, but that was the point of origin.
Okay.
Actually, I do think they kind of sounded like Fleetwood Mac, but whatever. Emerick continues. The vibe was so good that, this time around, Paul was invited by John to participate in both songs, which seemed to lift his spirits greatly.
Okay.
They even disappeared behind the screens at one point for a puff on a joint, just the two of them. And when they came out, they had a fit of giggles as they sang the pseudo-Spanish gibberish at the end of Here Comes the Sun King. In fact, they found it impossible to get through a take without dissolving into laughter.
Okay.
It really was a group effort, and all four Beatles played with energy and enthusiasm, each making his own unique contribution to the sound and arrangement. Even Ringo came up with a strong idea, draping his tom-toms with heavy tea towels and playing them with timpani beaters to give John the jungle drum sound he was after. This approach actually mirrored how Mick Fleetwood played drums on Albatross, though Ringo had to quickly switch to regular sticks for the Mean Mr. Mustard segment. John explained the inspiration behind Mean Mr. Mustard in his 1980 Playboy interview. I'd read somewhere in the paper about this mean guy who was hiding 5-pound notes, not up nose, but somewhere else. And so I wrote about him. And no, it has nothing to do with snorting cocaine. In fact, 2 newspaper articles appear to have influenced Mean Mr. Mustard. The first, from the Daily Record, dated June 7th, 1967, was titled, "A Mean Husband Shaved in the Dark." It described a man who shaved and went to bed in the dark to save electricity, and insisted on turning off the lights while listening to the radio, because it was not necessary to see in order to listen. This probably inspired John's lyric, "Shaves in the dark trying to save paper," with paper referring to money. The second article, published the same day in the Daily Mirror, was titled, "Scotsman Meanness Was Cruel." It stated, John Mustard, an exceptionally mean man, gave his wife only £1 in the year before they parted. The judge said that there was a menacing quality about him, to which his wife was particularly sensitive. John Alexander Mustard, 65 years old at the time, lived in Old Park View, Enfield, in North London, with his second wife, Freda. He died in 1984. The reference to £1 may have inspired John's lyric, "Keeps the 10-bob note up his nose," though the rest of the story was clearly shaped by John's imagination. Tony Bramwell, a former Apple Records executive, suggested another possible source of inspiration. In A Hard Day's Right, he said, "There was an old bag lady who used to hang around the Knightsbridge end of Hyde Park, close to the army barracks. She had all of her possessions in plastic bags and slept in the park. I'm sure that she had something to do with the song." This theory, however, has never been confirmed. Originally, John wanted the song to be a standalone track, potentially for the White Album. A demo recorded after the Beatles returned from India, later released on Anthology 3, indicates a bridge section that segues back to the first verse. In this demo, the character's sister was originally named Shirley, possibly referencing Shirley Evans, the accordionist in the Magical Mystery Tour film. The demo also is John uttering the word sheeps before the lyric, "sleeps in a hole in the road." Since the released version also includes the word sheeps, some have speculated that John may have meant the character was defecating in the hole, although this has also never been confirmed. John says, "My contribution is Polythene Pam, Sun King, and Mean Mr. Mustard. We juggled them about until it made vague sense. In Mean Mr. Mustard, I said his sister Pam. Originally, it was something like his sister Shirley in the lyric. I changed it to Pam to make it sound like it had something to do with it." Only the first two verses were used in the final album version. The bridge was never completed. John later dismissed the song, calling it a bit of crap. Paul, however, had a more positive view. Mean Mr. Mustard was very John. I liked that. A nice quirky song. One notable choice during the recording was having Paul play his Fender jazz bass through a fuzz box during the Mean Mr. Mustard section. He had to manually switch from the clean tone used during Sun King. It's not difficult to picture Mean Mr. Mustard as a fully developed Lennon track on the White Album, but within the context of this long medley, this shortened version of the song fits much better. Following the laid-back atmosphere of John's Sun King, the medley is re-energized by what Tom Riley calls in his book Tell Me Why, a short, punchy rock and roll sketch. That's another half a song I wrote in India about a kinky girl in a polythene bag, John said shortly after Abbey Road came out.
On an island off the French coast which belongs to English, and a man called Roy something, who was England's answer to Allen Ginsberg, who gave us our first exposure. This is so long, you can't deal with all this. You see, everything triggers amazing memories. Yeah. I'll get his name later because I'm getting tired now. It's hard work to pull things out. He was a beatnik that looked like a beatnik, and he came, and there weren't any jazz groups, there was only the Beatles, so it was the first rock and roll and poetry. He read poetry and we played blues, and he mentioned this in the paper. Years later, he had a job in Jersey TV. I met him when we were big and on tour, and he took me back to his apartment. I had a girl, and he had one that he'd said, "You want to meet her? Polythene Pam, she dresses up in polythene," which she did in polythene bags, and she didn't wear jack boots and kilt. I just sort of
she looks like a man.
Elaborate. No, not really that. Just polythene Pam's enough inspiration, isn't it, to start a whole ball game, right? Yeah. So that's what that was. Based on a real incident.
Make the news of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was kind of, perverted sex in the polythene bag. There was nothing really much to it. It's just looking for something to write about.
It's a bit like everything, you know, Not Fade Away by the Crickets and Summertime Blues by Eddie Cochran. When asked what Polythene Pam was about, he explained it was about a mythical Liverpool scrubber dressed in her jackboots and kilt. By scrubber, he meant a fan or a groupie, possibly suggesting she was promiscuous. The girl John likely had in mind was Pat Dawson, then known as Pat Hodgett. She was a regular at the Cavern Club when the Beatles played there in the early days. She was known for eating polythene, a British term for polyethylene, a type of plastic. Because of that, the Beatles nicknamed her Polythene Pat. John remembered this years later when writing Polythene Pam. I started going to see the Beatles in 1961 when I was 14, Pat says in A Hard Day's Write. And I got quite friendly with them. If they were playing out of town, they'd give me a lift back home in their van. It was about the same time that I started getting called Polythene Pat. It's embarrassing, really. I just used to eat polythene all the time. I'd tie it in knots and then eat it. Sometimes I even used to burn it and then eat it when it got cold. Then I had a friend who got a job in a polythene bag factory, which was wonderful because it meant that I had consistent supply. The poet John mentioned, England's answer to Allen Ginsberg, was Royston Ellis. He met the Beatles in May or June of 1960 when he came to Liverpool University to read poetry. That July, he arranged for them to back him at a poetry and music show at the Jacaranda Club. A piece in Record and Show Mirror from July 9, 1960, even said Ellis was thinking of taking the Beatles to London. I was quite a star for them at the time, Ellis recalled in A Hard Day's Write, because I'd come up from London, and that was a world they didn't really know about. I stayed with them for about a week in their flat at the Gambier Terrace during that 1960 visit. John was fascinated by the fact that I was a poet, and that led to deep conversations. The Beatles saw Ellis again during their 1963 tour, but that meeting actually took place in Guernsey, not Jersey, as John mistakenly said. A photo from August 8, 1963, shows Ellis with the band on Guernsey. He had a summer job there working as a ferry boat engineer, and met up with John after the show at his attic apartment. Years later, Ellis was interviewed for A Hard Day's Write. Not being involved in the British music scene anymore, Ellis wasn't aware of Polythene Pam, but he did remember what happened that day with his girlfriend at the time, Stephanie. We'd read all these things about leather, and we didn't have any leather, but I had my oilskins, and we had some polythene bags from somewhere. We all dressed up in them and wore them in bed. John stayed the night with us in the same bed. I don't think anything very exciting happened, and we all wondered what the fun was in being kinky. It was probably more my idea than John's. I can't really remember everything that happened. At that time, it meant nothing to me. It was just one event during a very eventful time in my life. Paul didn't help write Polythene Pam, but he also remembered that day. In his book, he writes, John, being Royston's friend, went out to dinner with him and got piss drunk and stuff, and they ended up back at his apartment with a girl who dressed herself in polythene for John's amusement. So it was a little kinky scene. She was a real character. The line, "she's the kind of girl that makes the news of the world," refers to the British tabloid News of the World, which was known for covering celebrity scandals. So the idea of perverted intercourse in a polythene bag could have easily been the kind of story the paper would publish. Polythene Pam was arranged to directly link into Paul's "she came in through the bathroom window." Apart from A Day in the Life, this was the first time two individual Lennon-McCartney songs were recorded and arranged as a single piece. Jeff Emmerich recalled the session. Things weren't quite so pleasant. John was unhappy with Ringo's drumming, commenting acidly at one point that it sounded like Dave Clark of the Dave Clark 5, which was clearly not meant as a compliment. He was so impatient at Ringo's inability to come up with a suitable part that he finally said, "Sod it, let's just put one down anyway." But Ringo was upset that John was unhappy with his drumming, and he spent a good deal of time working on it with Paul, even after the backing track was done. Finally, he said to John, "Why don't we just record the backing track again? I think I've got a part you'll like now." But John waved him off. "I'm not playing the bloody song again, Ring. If you want to redo the drums, go ahead and overdub them." That night, Ringo did just that. Fortunately, we were working in 8-track, so I was able to record the new drum track without erasing the old one. It took many hours to do, but Ringo eventually pulled it off, managing to play the new drum part from start to finish without losing the beat. And those were the days before we had click tracks, so his only reference was the original drum track, which we fed to him through headphones. Paul overdubbed his bass on Polythene Pam, and at one point he overshot the note on one of his glissandos. Instinctively he said, "Oops, let me drop that in and fix it." But we all spontaneously overruled him, saying, "No, it's great, leave it in." Even George Martin got into the spirit of things. When someone made a mistake like that and the others liked it, we'd often actually make it louder when we mixed the song so as to accentuate it. Sometimes we would even double track the mistake with other instruments to make it even more obvious. It was all about playing a little joke on the fans, giving them a treat, something to talk about. That's what we did on Polythene Pam. Paul's overshoot actually became a feature. For all of the kerfuffle, they were fun tracks to record. I commented to George Martin that it sounded like old-style Beatles, like the four of them playing together as a band circa 1963. "You're right," George said sardonically. "You'd never guess that the four of them actually can't stand each other." Then, George played the descending electric guitar line linking Pam to Bathroom Window. John re-recorded his lead vocal, now using a pronounced Scouse accent, and adding an ad-lib during George's guitar solo. "Fab, isn't that great? It's real good, that. Real good. Listen to that, Mal," he said, referring to Mal Evans. As the transition into Bathroom Window began, John shouted, "Oh, look out," a portion of which made it onto the final version. Originally, Paul's short acoustic piece, Her Majesty, was placed between Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam, but Paul didn't like the result and asked for Her Majesty to be removed, with Mustard now leading directly into Polythene Pam. In a September 1969 interview, John said that She Came In Through the Bathroom Window began in mid-May of 1968. It was when Paul and I went to America to publicize Apple about 2 years ago, and we were just in the flat we were staying in, and he had just come out with that line, "She came in through the bathroom window." So he had it for years, and he eventually finished it. John and Paul's visit to New York was to promote AppleCore through various press events, including an appearance on The Tonight Show, but not with Johnny Carson, sadly. Before this trip, an unusual event occurred at Paul's home in St. John's Wood, involving a few Apple scruffs, which was what the Beatles called the devoted fangirls who regularly waited outside their studios, offices, or homes. Diane Ashley, one of the fans, described the event. We were bored, he was out, and so we decided to pay him a visit. We found a ladder in his garden and stuck it up at the bathroom window, which he'd left slightly open. I was the one who climbed and got in. She then let a few others in through the front door. "I don't regret any of it," she said. "I had a great time. A really great time." Another Apple scruff, Margot Bird, said, "They rummaged around and took some clothes. People didn't usually take anything of real value, but I think this time a lot of photographs and negatives were taken. There were really two groups of Apple scruffs, those who would break in and those who would just wait outside with cameras and autograph books. I used to take Paul's dog for a walk and got to know him quite well. I was eventually offered a job at Apple. I started by making the tea and ended up in the promotions department, working with Tony King. While working at Apple, Paul asked Margot for help retrieving some of his belongings. I knew who had done it, and I discovered that a lot of the stuff had already gone to America, she remembered. But I knew that there was one picture he particularly wanted back, a color-tinted picture of him in a 30s frame. I knew who had taken this and got it back for him. Ian MacDonald suggests the photo was actually of Paul's father, which would make sense given the description. Diane Ashley, who had climbed into Paul's house through the bathroom window, was surprised to hear the event made it into a Beatles song. I didn't believe it at first because he'd hated it so much when we broke in. But then I suppose anything can inspire a song, can't it? I know all his neighbors rang him when they saw that we'd gotten in, and I'm sure that gave rise to the lines, Sundays on the phone to Monday, Tuesdays on the phone to me. I did have some of those out-of-the-ordinary ideas, Paul said. For example, I used to see the days of the week in colors. Monday was black, Tuesday was yellow. Wednesday's green, Thursday was dark blue, Friday was red, Saturday was orange, and Sunday was white. When I saw the name of the day of the week, I pictured them like that. It's a form of synesthesia. So the lines, Sundays on the phone to Monday, Tuesdays on the phone to me, are particularly resonant for me. I use essentially the same device in Lady Madonna, where I have Friday night arrives without a suitcase, and Sunday morning creeping like a nun. And it seems to be fruitful ground for me. The lyric, protected by a silver spoon, also had a personal meaning for Paul. In the lyrics, he wrote, even though my mother was never anything more than a nurse or midwife, and my dad never anything more than a cotton salesman, we always thought of ourselves as posh working class. It's a mental attitude. Our attitude was posh. We aspired to do better in every department. We usually associate the idea of being born with a silver spoon in your mouth with nobility, but even in my, albeit posh, working-class family, I was given a silver spoon at the time of my christening. I knew nothing about it until, years later, my Auntie Dill told me that she had kept it safe for me, literally and metaphorically, until my mom died. I had quite a lucky childhood. I was protected by a silver spoon.
Okay, makes sense.
While some lyrics relate directly to Paul's experience with the Apple Scruffs, others appear more imaginative, such as her being a dancer who's worked at 15 clubs a day, and who could steal but could not rob. Paul reflected, a nice distinction if ever there was one. The rest of the lyrics remain mysterious or personal to Paul. I think music can be a very visual art, really, he said. It's image-driven. We can see the dancer working 15 clubs a day. We can see the character quit the police department. The meaning of wanders by the banks of her lagoon remains unknown. She came in through the bathroom window was an easy choice for the medley, so Paul brought it back and added it right after John's unfinished Polythene Pam.
If you're looking for footwear that combines style, comfort, and resistance, the signature men's boot is the right choice.
I think a lot of people might be surprised that you sort of dare to take Golden Slumbers, the well-known lullaby, and give it a new variation. I enjoyed it very much, but what made you decide to do that? Because the Beatles have never done that before, have they? No. Taken another tune or lyrics?
No. Well, I'll tell you, I was just playing the piano in Liverpool, my dad's house, and my sister Ruth's piano book, she was learning piano, and you know those sort of with Do You Ken John Peel? Yeah. And Golden Slumbers and your old favourites, was up on the thing, you know, it was this stand, you know, it was a little book with all those words in it and stuff. So I was just flicking through it and I came to Golden Slumbers, you know. So I just started, because I can't read music, so I didn't know the tune. Okay. I can't remember the old tune, you know. So I started just playing my tune to it. And then I liked the words, so I just kept that, you know, and then it fitted with another bit of song I had, which is the verse in between it, so I just made that into a song. It just happened because I was reading her book.
He shared a bit more in many years from now. I liked the words so much, I thought it was very restful, a very beautiful lullaby, but I couldn't read the melody, not being able to read music. So I just took the words and wrote my own music. I didn't know at the time it was 400 years old. This all happened sometime in 1968, when Paul visited his dad's house, Rembrandt, in Heswall, Cheshire, about 15 miles from Liverpool. Paul had bought the place for his dad back in July 1964, once the Beatles started making good money. Paul's mom had died when he was 14, and his dad, Jim McCartney, later remarried a woman named Angela. And that's how Paul ended up with a stepsister, Ruth, the same Ruth whose piano book he was flipping through that day in 1968. It was later set to music in 1885 by W.J. Henderson, under the title Golden Slumbers, Kiss Your Eyes. It first showed up in a 1603 play called The Pleasant Comedy of Patient Grizzle. By the time Paul found it, the piece was long out of any potential copyright, so there was no issue in using it. Paul had a vague memory of the lullaby from when he was younger too, which makes sense since he said, "I couldn't remember the old tune." Here's the original poem by Thomas Dekker. Golden slumbers kiss your eyes. Smiles awake you when you rise. Sleep, pretty wantons, do not cry, and I will sing a lullaby. Rock them, lullaby. Care is heavy, therefore sleep you. You are care, and care must keep you. And I will sing a lullaby. Rock them, lullaby. Paul said, it fit with another bit of song I had. In the lyrics, he also talked about where some of the emotion behind the lyrics may have come from. It's very possible that I'd been feeling down in London. I was back in the solace of family and Liverpool, and what with the Beatles' troubles down south, I was likely thinking, wouldn't it be nice to get home and have that comfortable feeling again? So there may have been some of that in the background. I wouldn't rule it out. When I wrote the song, I hadn't been back home to Liverpool for a long time. But now I was at my dad's house, which wasn't quite home because it was a house I'd bought him when I got some money. But it was still Liverpool, and it was still homeward. So I added, once there was a way to get back homeward, once there was a way to get back home. The song turned out to be quite soulful, and I think that's what attracted me to those lyrics in the first place. That notion of consoling a baby or reading kids a bedtime story. Later on, when putting together the big medley, Paul thought it would work well to pair Golden Slumbers with a reprise of You Never Give Me Your Money, which he had written a few months later. It worked musically as they were both in the same key, and shared a general feeling of sad farewell, as Ian MacDonald put it in Revolution in the Head. Geoff Emerick reveals, no one was sure how John would react to the medley idea, but we got on with the work anyway. There seemed to be an assumption that he would go along with it, and that this time around, in contrast to the White Album, he wouldn't be calling the shots. John was actually on board after all, as he said in a May 1969 interview that he liked the idea of a kind of song montage that we might do as one piece on one side. Even though Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight are separate songs on the album, the session notes just called the whole thing Golden Slumbers at the time. The orchestral part was recorded on August 15th in Studio One, but there was a technical challenge, as Emerick explained. EMI had still not installed an 8-track tape recorder or large-scale console into the Studio One control room, so we were forced to set up a complicated system of audio tie lines and closed-circuit television that allowed the musicians to be seated in the larger Studio One while we recorded them in the control room of Studio Two. The orchestral recording covered mostly Paul's songs, Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, and The End. Emerick added, following the pattern that had been established for much of the album, the only Beatle at this session was Paul. Phil MacDonald, however, was there with me, Working in 2 studios at once really complicated things, and we needed the extra pair of hands. George Martin did the conducting while Paul essentially produced his own session. Thankfully, there were no major technical mishaps, and everything worked smoothly. Engineer Alan Brown recalled in the Beatles recording sessions, "It was a mammoth session. We had a large number of lines linking the studios, and we were all walking around the building with walkie-talkies trying to communicate with each other. It costs a lot of money. All the musicians have to be paid, fed, and watered. I screw every pound note out of it whenever I play the record." John shared his thoughts about the orchestral stuff in a 1969 interview. He laid the strings on after we had finished most of the basic tracks. "I personally can't be bothered with strings and things. I like to do with the group or electronics, you know. I can't be bothered with the hassles of the musicians and all that bit, you know. It's such a drag trying to get them together, but Paul digs that." So that's his scene. And it was up to him where he went with the violins, really, and what he did with them. I think he just wanted a straight kind of backing, you know, nothing freaky. The orchestra took about 3 hours to record Golden Slumbers / Carry That Weight and The End, all put on track 8 of the tape. The musicians followed George Martin's score exactly. The balance of the lyrics and the melody line found in Golden Slumbers, amid the piano backdrop and the orchestral swells, betrays the sentiments of nostalgia and longing, while his lyrically similar "Get Back to Where You Once Belonged" implied a musical return to form for his band. Paul's aching "Once there was a way to get back homeward" created the feeling that if only we could go back to a time in our childhood, all would be right in the world. In the bosom of our mother, we could happily fall asleep while she sang us a lullaby. With the later realization that this was the opening portion of the last musical segment of the last recorded Beatles album, not counting the humorous snippet, Her Majesty, an even more poignant message emerges that particularly resonates with their fans. The message becomes, "It was a fun ride that we're very glad you joined us in, but there is no going back. It's now time to part, but don't cry. The memories are always there to cherish." There are quite a few Beatles songs that took shape in the recording studio different from how they were originally conceived. John's Come Together was originally intended as a Chuck Berry-style rocker until it was transformed into a more subdued, swampy-sounding hit song. I'll Be Back was attempted in the studio in a waltz beat, as shown in Anthology 1, and Paul's tender acoustic ballad, And I Love Her, was first tried as a full band arrangement with electric guitars and drums. However, probably the biggest transformation to a Beatles song from what the composer originally intended would be Carry That Weight. Sometime around December 1968, Paul came up with this upbeat country-style tune called Carry That Weight. It had a bit of that Buck Owens vibe, you know, sort of like Act Naturally, which the Beatles had already covered during Help. Ringo's idea, of course. Okay. Paul's plan was to write verses about a guy who had a pretty good life, but let little problems get to him. Each verse would lead into the catchy chorus. The whole thing was meant to sound like it was from the guy's point of view. When Paul first showed the song to the rest of the band during Get Back, he was sitting at the organ and saying, "I was thinking it was a song for Ringo." Since every album had a Ringo song, he figured this could be it. But the idea of it being a Ringo song didn't last. The next day, Paul slowed it down and paired it with Golden Slumbers, turning it into a medley. He played the combo on piano during rehearsal. The big Abbey Road Medley idea wasn't around just yet, but this ended up being a big part later. A few days later, on January 9th, Paul played the medley again for Ringo and explained where it came from. He told Ringo, "It's like a story, a bit like Act Naturally, where a tagline keeps coming up, you know. So and so and so and so." But all he said was Act Naturally. It's like your troubles, but it was like a comedy when I first heard or conceived it. Later on, though, Paul talked about the song like it came from a darker place. I'm generally quite upbeat, but at certain times things get to me so much that I just can't be upbeat anymore. And that was one of those times. Carry that weight a long time, like forever. That's what I meant. The weird part, Paul actually wrote the song before all of the Alan Klein drama. Klein didn't even meet with John until late January 1969. Still, by the time they were recording it for Abbey Road in July and August, Paul was right in the middle of all that mess, so he probably started connecting the song's vibe to the tension in the band. In the lyrics, Paul explained, "We were entering a period in the mid to late 60s when we were doing LSD, staying up all night. That period weighed on me. It was a place you just didn't want to be, with people you didn't want to be with." The idea of carrying a weight may have been influenced by the band's song, The Weight. There's a great picture that Linda took of Alan Klein, in which he's got a hammer like Maxwell's silver hammer. It's very symbolic. And that's why we have the little nod and wink in the middle section. In the lines, "I never give you my pillow, I only send you my invitations." Tim Riley explains Carry That Weight as the larger implications of fame and notoriety, obligation and commitment, the weight in the singer's heart. He then goes on to state that the ironies become palpable. The love song Paul sings to the Beatles spells out the price that fame has extracted from their friendship. Ian MacDonald says, "No matter what they do separately after this, Paul correctly guesses it'll never match what they did together, and the world will always hark back to their glory days as a foursome, and they'll carry the weight of their achievement as the Beatles for the rest of their individual careers." Both of these interpretations are very fanciful, to say the least, retrospectively assuming that Paul was summing up his band's career and song. And to think, Carry That Weight was just Paul simply wanting to write a fictional country and western song for Ringo to sing. The Beatles song The End, which wraps up Abbey Road, is often seen by fans and writers as their big farewell message. But was it actually meant that way? As they kept working on the medley, they realized it needed a strong ending. And as the 70s approached and hard rock was starting to take shape, Paul decided the medley on Abbey Road should go out with a bang. Something loud and powerful. Bands like Jimi Hendrix, Cream, Led Zeppelin, and Mountain were leading the way with this new heavy guitar sound, and the Beatles decided to lean into that vibe too. So on July 23rd, they recorded a tight, distorted guitar jam to close out the medley. At that point, it was just called Ending, and lasted about a minute and 20 seconds, stopping abruptly. If you picture the final version cutting off right before Paul's soft piano chords, that's actually originally what it sounded like. But Paul wanted to go a little deeper. Not just noise, he wanted meaning. Soon after, he came up with a more thoughtful ending to follow the heavy guitar part. By early August, he added a final lyrical idea to wrap things up properly. In Many Years From Now, Paul explained, "Shakespeare ended his acts with a rhyming couplet so that the audience would know they were over. I wanted it to end with a meaningful couplet, so I followed the bard and wrote a couplet." John was into it too. In 1980, he said, "It had a nice line in it. The love you take is equal to the love you make." It was a very cosmic, philosophical line. It proves that if Paul wants to, he can think. So the final form of The End came together in July and August of 1969. John later gave Paul the full credit for the song, so it's safe to call it a McCartney creation. Still, Paul made sure to leave space in the song for each of the guys to shine, with solos from all three guitarists, and even a rare drum solo from Ringo. A fitting finish, even if it wasn't meant to be the band's last word. "Solos have never interested me," Ringo said. "That drum solo is still the only one I've done. I was opposed to it. I don't want to do no bloody solo." George Martin convinced me. As I was playing it, he counted it because we needed a time. It was the most ridiculous thing. I was going dum dum 1 2 3 4, and I had to come off that strange place because it was 13 bars long. Anyway, I did it, and it's out of the way. I'm pleased now that we've got one down. George Martin was in the studio with the group instead of the control room for the recording, the purpose apparently being to help Ringo keep the drum solo measures straight, and to stipulate when his bandmates were coming back in to conclude the song. Even after extensive coaching from Paul, Ringo wasn't sure if he was going to play, and I could see that he wasn't the least bit confident that he could pull it off either. We had to do a lot of takes, and each take was quite different. The final solo he played was actually considerably longer than what eventually made it onto the album. With input from Paul and George Martin, I edited down significantly, using only the best bits. There was a particular inspiration that Ringo had for his drum solo. Ron Bushy, drummer from the rock group Iron Butterfly, explains in Andy Babiuk's book Beatles Gear, "We played London back in '71, and Ringo and Paul came to see us. Ringo sent up his man backstage and invited me out to a private club called Tramps. We had dinner and drinks, and we were up all night shooting the shit. He told me then that he kinda copped my solo in Agata Divida for their song The End on Abbey Road. And I just thought, that was cool. It was the biggest compliment that I could ever get." An interesting event happened while the Beatles were in the control room, listening back to the result of Ringo's solo, as witnessed by Jeff Emmerich. When the four Beatles trooped upstairs to listen to some playbacks, Yoko stayed behind, stretched out languorously in the bed, wearing the usual flimsy nightgown and tiara. As we were listening, I noticed that something down in the studio had caught George's attention. After a moment or two, he began staring bug-eyed out the control room window. Curious, I looked over his shoulder. Yoko had gotten out of bed and was slowly padding across the studio floor, finally coming to a stop at George's Leslie cabinet, which had a packet of McVitie's digestive biscuits on top. Idly, she began opening the packet and delicately removed a single biscuit. Just as the morsel reached her mouth, George could contain himself no longer. "That bitch!" Everyone looked aghast, but we all knew exactly who he was talking about. "She's just taken one of my biscuits," George explained. He wasn't the least bit sheepish either. As far as he was concerned, those biscuits were his property, and no one was allowed to go near them. John began shouting back at him, but there was little he could say to defend his wife, who, oblivious, was happily munching away in the studio, because he shared exactly the same attitude towards food. Actually, I think the argument was not so much about the biscuits, but about the bed, which they had all come to deeply resent. What Harrison was really saying was, if Yoko is well enough to get out of bed and steal one of my biscuits, she doesn't need to be in the bloody bed in the first place. It almost didn't matter what the argument was about. By this stage, whenever the four of them were together, it was like a tinderbox, and anything could set them off, even something as dumb as a digestive biscuit. Emmerich continues, "There were quite a few empty bars to fill after Ringo's drum solo. Paul had left them bare in the spirit of, we'll think of something eventually, just as we had done with the middle section of A Day in the Life. And there was a long discussion about what to add on top to flesh it out. Well, a guitar solo is the obvious thing, said George. Yes, but this time you should let me play it, said John jokingly. He loved playing lead guitar. He'd often mess about doing lead parts during rehearsals. But he knew that he didn't have the finesse of either George or Paul, so he rarely did so on record. Everyone laughed, including John, but we could see that he was at least half serious. I know, he said mischievously, unwilling to let it go. Why don't we all play the solo? We can take turns and trade licks. It was a suggestion that clearly had merit. George Martin looked dubious, but Paul not only embraced the idea, but upped the ante further still. Better yet, he said, why don't all three of us play it live? Yeah. John loved the idea. For the first time in weeks, I saw a real gleam in his eye. It didn't take long for John's enthusiasm to rub off on George, who finally got into the spirit of things. Paul announced that he wanted to take the first solo, and since it was his song, the others deferred. Ever competitive, John said that he had a great idea for an ending, so he was going to go last. As always, poor George was overshadowed by his two bandmates, and he got the middle spot by default. Yoko, as usual, was sitting by John's side in the control room while they were having this discussion. But as John got up to walk out into the studio, he turned to her and said gently, "Wait here, love. I won't be a minute." She looked a little shocked and hurt, But she did as John asked, sitting quietly by the control room window for the remainder of the session. It was almost as if he knew that she would put a damper on things and spoil the atmosphere if she were in the studio with them. Something inside told John that to get this to work, he needed to be doing it with just Paul and George. That it would be better for Yoko not to be by his side this one time. Maybe that was the reason. Or perhaps on some subconscious level, they decided to suspend their egos for the sake of the music. But for the hour or so that it took them to play those solos, all the bad blood, all the fighting, all the crap that had gone down between these former friends was forgotten. John, Paul, and George looked like they had gone back in time, like they were kids again, playing together for the sheer enjoyment of it. More than anything, they reminded me of gunslingers, with their guitars strapped on and looks of steely-eyed resolve, determined to outdo one another. Yet there was no animosity, no tension at all. You could tell that they were simply having fun. It was the first time in a long time that the three of them were actually playing together in the studio. For most of the Abbey Road sessions, it was just one or two of them, plus sometimes Ringo. For me, that session was undoubtedly the high point of the summer of 1969, and listening to those guitar solos still never fails to bring a smile to my face. If the good feelings engendered by that one day had only been present throughout the entire project, there's no telling how great Abbey Road would have been. Now, you'd think that this dramatic, final-sounding song, complete with Ringo's only drum solo and Paul's famous line, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make," had to be their planned goodbye. But that's not actually how it went down. The last time all four Beatles were in the studio together was August 20th, 1969. They were there to finalize the Abbey Road track list. And here's a twist. Originally, side one of the album was going to end with a big medley, ending with, well, the end. Side two was supposed to finish with "I Want You, She's So Heavy," John's intense, dramatic track. So, at first, they didn't intend for the end to be their last goodbye at all, just a cool wrap-up to the medley. Still, retrospectively, it was the perfect last hurrah for the Beatles. It made Paul's closing line feel way more profound, and listening to it today, it really does feel like the Beatles riding off into the sunset forever. Whether or not that was the plan, hey, it's a beautiful way to imagine it. But wait, there's more.
There's more?
In his book Many Years From Now, Paul said he wrote Her Majesty while staying in his Mull of Kintyre home in southwest Scotland. He said, "It was quite funny because it's basically monarchist, with a mildly disrespectful tone, but it's very tongue-in-cheek. It's almost like a love song to the Queen." Derek Taylor added, "Paul sang that knowing the Queen would enjoy it. We are monarchists."
And what about the reference to the Queen? What made you put that on the LP? That's caused a lot of surprises. Very nice, but it was, you know, a lot of people didn't know it was there.
I saw your column in the daily newspaper.
I wish I could have got a hold of you.
That was just, I don't know, you know, I was in Scotland and I was just writing this little tune. You know, I can never tell, like, how tunes come out. I just wrote it as a joke, you know. I wrote this tune and it happened to start off, Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl. She doesn't have a lot to say. So I just wrote those little, you know, I wrote a few more lines with it. And just as a little sort of joke tune, you know. Her Majesty, I thought of it as the Queen, you know, just because I'd think of that as Her Majesty. Well, it was around about the time the royal family was on telly too. Yes. You know, that big film about them. You know, I mean, you could refer, like they refer to a girl as, you know, lady or girl or, you know, like Lady Madonna or just some sort of name, you know, to call a girl. It could be that too, you know, like Her Majesty, you know, worshipping your girlfriend or your wife.
Yes, I see. So it's not to be taken too seriously.
Not really, you know, you can if you like. Yeah. I don't.
Yes.
Paul gave more detail in his book, The Lyrics. You're sitting around with an acoustic guitar, just for your own fun, and then you get a little idea, and sometimes it's enough to finish up a big song. Her Majesty was just a little fragment, really. I didn't know what to do with it. It's tongue-in-cheek, treating the Queen as if she were just a nice girl and not bothering with the fact that she would become the longest reigning monarch ever in the UK, or the fact that she was the Queen of the nation. It's just being cheeky. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. That seemed to be true. She doesn't say much. Only the annual Queen's speech at Christmas and at the opening of Parliament. The song's melody and structure seem to be inspired by Robert Johnson's 1936 recording, They're Red Hot. Paul never said this was his direct influence, but the similarity is too strong to be a coincidence. It's likely that he drew on music from the 1920s and 30s, since his dad had introduced him to that era of music. As for when it was written, Radio Luxembourg DJ Tony MacArthur remembered, "When the Beatles' double album was released, at the time I did a program with Paul, and he played Her Majesty to me at that time. In fact, it was on that White Album tape, when we were just getting levels and things. So it must have been written and recorded as a demo by November 1968. Decades later, Paul was one of many guest performers who played at the Party at the Palace at Buckingham Palace Garden in London on June 3, 2002. This event was in commemoration of the Golden Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, Her Majesty herself being in attendance. When introduced toward the end of the show, Paul's first act was to perform Her Majesty, replacing his finger-picking style with straight chords, undoubtedly because it had been so long since he had last played it. After its conclusion, he stated, "I had to do it." As the camera focused on the Queen, she didn't seem impressed. She undoubtedly had never heard the song before. "I did perform this song for the Queen," Paul recalled in his book The Lyrics. "I don't know how to break this to you, but she didn't have a lot to say."
The end. For real this time. Hey, yeah. So, once again, the story behind the Abbey Road Medley. So, yeah, shout outs to the channel, Beatles Bible, for this video. Guys, wow. I have to say, this was an incredible deep dive, you know. It was a lot to take in, I must admit. The story behind the Abbey Road Medley, you know, from the Beatles, to me, you know, isn't just a breakdown, you know, of music. You know, to me, it's a full-on journey, you know, through the creative genius of the Beatles, you know, in their final chapter together. Right away, after watching this video, I have to say that I loved, you know, how this video, you know, sets the stage. You know, I love the way it captures the fact that this wasn't just songs, you know, stuck together. I mean, but rather a carefully woven musical tapestry that turned side 2, you know, of Abbey Road into one of the greatest, you know, album finale, you know, in rock history. The way Beatles Bible, the channel, you know, explains, you know, the transition, you know, from scraps, you know, of unfinished songs into a single cohesive medley, you know, to me really brings you into the band's, you know, creative process. Musically, the video also, you know, highlights on how Paul McCartney and John Lennon, you know, were essentially switching together little fragments, you know, and somehow, you know, with George Martin's, you know, guidance, you know, they made it feel seamless. Hearing about, you know, the contrast between Paul's more upbeat, you know, melodic sections, you know, and John's raw, you know, sometimes darker ideas, you know, gave me an even deeper appreciation, you know, for their dynamic. One of my favorite parts, you know, of this video was the explanation on how the medley builds, you know, emotionally. I mean, from the playful, mean Mr. Mustard, you know, to the power, you know, of Golden Slumbers. And I mean, finally, that iconic ending, the end, you know, it definitely shows how the Beatles, you know, weren't just writing songs. You know, they were, you know, creating an experience. And when Ringo's drum solo, you know, was mentioned, guys, that was goosebumps for me personally. I mean, it's like the band, you know, wanted to give, you know, every member, you know, their moment, you know, in the spotlight, you know, before closing the curtain. The narration and the pacing of this video, you know, it was excellent. You know, it was clear, it was insightful, and filled with nuggets, you know, of trivia that even, you know, hardcore Beatles fans might not know. What really stood out to me after watching this video is how, Beatles Bible balanced the music theory, historical context, and storytelling. It wasn't just educational, I have to say. It was engaging, from start to finish. This was like over an hour, and I had to, sit all the way through. Overall, this video really reminded me why Abbey Road, is often considered the Beatles, masterpiece. The medley, is not only a celebration of their legacy, but also a bittersweet farewell. Beatles really captured that essence perfectly, if you ask me. So yeah, if you're a Beatles fan, if you're a music lover, or just curious about how one of the greatest moments in rock was created, I feel like this video is an absolute must watch. And I mean, before I leave, special love, special shout outs to Beatles for throwing this my way. Guys, if I'm to say this is a buy me a coffee suggestion, So just in case you want to support me, just in case you want to support the channel, link is in the description. You can tap in and send your suggestions and support the channel or support me. Yeah. So if you stuck with me to the end of the video, you're loved. You're very much appreciated on here. My name is Philip, and also the next music reaction. Take care, stay safe. Peace out.